Thanks, Brooks. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, Brooks did a nice job of setting up the macro situation and talk about the different drivers of the economy and talked a lot about housing markets and how that translates into lumber demand. Now we're going to talk about how the mills are responding to that and what has been happening with mill capacity and mill production in the U.S., the South, and in Georgia. And then we're going to talk a little bit about timber supplies and how those might change in the next 10 years, also in the South and in Georgia. And then I'll end my portion of the talk talking about how we manage those forests today and presenting a little bit of the research that we've recently done a few months ago on tracking silviculture investments. And that's a survey that we implemented that several of you in this room participated in. So we'll talk about that in the next few minutes. Wanted to start off by talking about sawmill capacity. And this is a chart that shows sawmill capacity in the U.S. South over time. So the bars are the capacity of the mills to produce lumber if they were running 100% utilization. And then the line on top of the graph represents utilization of the mills. And what we see in this chart is that in the U.S. South, not only is investment increasing, which Brooks shared, but actually capacity has been increasing as well, and utilization has been increasing at the same time. In the past 3 years, sawmill capacity in the U.S. South has increased by 9%, whereas in the West it only increased by 1%. So this is just continued documentation of the shift of lumber production from the West to the South, and that continues today. And we see that in the data represented by what the mills are doing across the South. Utilization is up as well. Current utilization in the U.S. South for lumber mills, for sawmills, is at 90%. So this is the highest level it's been since 2005. So our mills are running wide open and continuing to increase utilization. And then on top of that, we have continued investment and interest in increasing capacity in the South even beyond these levels. And we're tracking mill investments and expansions and documenting those. And of the expansions and investments that we know about from 2015 to 2018, if we add all of that capacity up, and this includes Klausner's investment in North Carolina, it includes Buer Lumber building a new sawmill, a 200 million board foot sawmill in Mississippi, includes Conifex's potential investment in Arkansas. So these types of investments, when we add all of that together, we could add 1.3 billion board feet of capacity to the South. So a little bit of that is included in the chart in 2015, but a lot of that, including some of those greenfield investments, would be additional capacity. And we need that mill capacity to come to the South to produce the lumber in the projections that Brooks showed earlier. So we're seeing a lot of this actually happening on the ground in terms of what the mills are doing and where the investment is happening. Another sector that has shown some growth has been structural panels. And the story for structural panels is really a split story. It's really two different stories for two different industries, plywood and OSB. The plywood story is really a story of growth, or excuse me, the plywood story is a story of retraction, while the OSB story is a story of growth. The plywood capacity in the U.S., so this represents the U.S. Plywood capacity in the U.S. has actually fallen over the past 15 years. It's actually declined by 50% since 1990. And post-recession, the plywood sector has reallocated capacity actually to the West. So in this particular industry, we've actually seen a reallocation of capacity to the West. But a lot of that phenomenon happened because many mills in the South shut down or really drew back from plywood capacity. So it's a shrinking sector, but increasingly more of the capacity to produce plywood is found in the West. 700 million square feet of capacity, in fact, shifted from the South to the West. The sector has really not increased capacity or production in the past 4 years. So you can see on the chart it's been pretty flat for the past 4 years, which is in sharp contrast to OSB. So you can see that in the OSB figure, we have seen growth. We've seen substantial growth. OSB capacity has actually tripled from 1990 to 2007. So a pre-recession story, we've had huge increases in OSB capacity. We had a dip in the recession, and then recently OSB capacity again has been increasing. And a lot of this has been happening in the South. 80% of the OSB capacity in this country is located in the U.S. South. And even in the plywood situation, 64% of our plywood capacity is located in the South. So it's still a very important sector to the South, but it's been a declining one. OSB's market share of structural panels has been increasing as well, and that's part of this phenomenon, is that more of the structural panel production is shifting over to OSB. And OSB currently represents 66% of the structural panels that are produced in the country today, and that's been increasing. I wanted to talk a little bit about the pulp and paper sector. The pulp and paper sector is not going away. We still hear announcements in the news. There are mills that are shutting down. There are mills that are cutting back production. But then there are other mills that have been investing. And actually, overall, this sector has been investing. And so just to say pulp and paper is going away is really not a true statement. You really have to dig in and look at the specific end markets that the mills are serving to see what's going on for the overall sector. From 2012 to 2015, the sector actually invested $1 billion in the pulp and paper industry. So this is $1 billion that went to mills that are already operating. So this is existing infrastructure. Most of that investment went into household and sanitary products. So that's like toilet paper, tissue, diapers, that type of product. The household product got most of that investment, but also packaging sectors got investment as well. So our container boards, liner boards, all of the packaging, cardboard type material got a substantial amount of investment as well. And for 2016 and beyond, we have over $1 billion of investment that's been announced in the press and by these companies. So there is investment going on. But as I mentioned, and as we see in the news, there's also some retraction going on in the sector. And a lot of that has to do with the declining sectors, such as printing and writing papers and newsprint. And we have an example from Georgia that just happened this summer. Resolute Forest Products in Augusta shut down, they permanently shut down a newsprint machine, and that's impacting timber markets. And that's in one of those declining sectors of newsprint. So we do see those declines, and they do impact markets. But then on the flip side, other mills are investing in their infrastructure and investing to actually shift from making these products such as printing and writing papers and newsprint into making some of these other sectors where the demand for those products are increasing. So we're seeing that. And just another statistic for you, in terms of overall investment in the forest industry sector over the past 3 years, almost half of that investment has gone into pulp and paper facilities. So we are seeing a lot of that funding going into these facilities for these increasing end markets in terms of demand. When we translate all of this into wood demand and think about, well, what's going to happen in the future and what do we think these pulp and paper facilities are going to use in terms of wood, we're really projecting stable to slightly increasing levels of pulpwood demand going into these facilities. And underneath the hood, there's a lot of shifting going on. So we do project some declines in newsprint, printing and writing, and we are projecting increases in packaging and some increases in household and sanitary products. So overall, that really nets out into a slightly increasing profile for demand for pulpwood. But a lot of shifting is going on underneath the hood there. Let's talk for a minute about bioenergy. So bioenergy continues to be very interesting for timberland owners and also for asset owners in the South especially. There's a lot of uncertainty in bioenergy markets, and there's a lot of announcements every day about different pellet facilities or different bioenergy facilities. And so it does take constant attention to keep up with that. And there's a lot of policy drivers in this sector, so those also change quite frequently. But as many of you know, as we've already talked about at this conference, for bioenergy drivers in the U.S. South, pellet mills and pellet projects are the primary driver of bioenergy activity in the South and are the source of a lot of continued announcements and a lot of interest. And I'm sharing some data with you. This is actually preliminary data, so it might change slightly at our publication time in a few weeks, but this is some preliminary data on pellet capacity projections. And the way that we came up with these projections are that we're tracking the bioenergy companies in the U.S. and tracking the different announcements that these companies are making in new facilities. And when a company makes an announcement, we document it and put it in a database, and then we add up all of the wood demand from those announcements to get these projections. So they're based on what companies say they're going to do and when they say they may open facilities. We do some tracking of bioenergy announcements to try to screen out some of the projects that may not actually happen, and we look at technology and developmental status of the projects to do that. So the information in the slide is the screened information. So these are the projects that pass the basic viability screens on having a technology that's proven at scale, and they've passed some developmental milestones. And so based on this assessment of announcements with our screening process, we project that pellet capacity in the U.S. will get to 16 million short tons in 5 years. Actually could get there a little bit sooner. But most of that, almost 70% of that, is from export-oriented projects. And when we look at pellet projects and the pellet markets in the U.S. and pellet production, it's really split into two different markets. One is the domestic market, so that's the dark green at the bottom of the chart. The domestic market in the U.S. is really the home heating market. So these are plants that are making pellets that are sold in hardware stores, sold at Lowe's and Home Depot, and they go into pellet stoves to heat homes. So there is a market there for that product in the U.S. The export pellets are mainly shipped to Europe to be burned in power plants as a substitute for coal. So that's really an primarily industrial market. There are heating markets in Europe that we do service, but overall, most of the pellets that we're shipping out from the U.S. South, from Georgia, are going to power plants to be burned to make electricity. And in this projection, most of the growth is related to that export market, and 70% of the volume going into the pellet capacity is actually export. And a lot of the pellets that we send over to Europe, actually 83% of the pellets that we shipped overseas in the first quarter of this year, 83% of those went to the UK. 15% of those went to Belgium. But we're very, very heavily dependent on the UK market. And there's been a lot going on in the UK recently. You know, they decided to leave the EU, and we have a lot of news and a lot of interest in Brexit and what implications that could have on pellet markets and how that might change dynamics here, because that's a very big market for us in the US. And we looked into that, and it's very, very hard to project what types of impacts something like Brexit will have on pellet markets. But we think it actually would have very, very small implications, primarily because the UK has its own energy policy. It's called the Climate Change Act of 2008. And in that policy, the UK sets country-wide standards and regulations for how they're going to meet different targets in terms of renewable energy. And so that particular policy is not tied to the EU specifically. It's something that the UK developed. And that's really what's driving investments in pellet markets and driving investments here in the US. So that's not specifically tied to the EU. So we think that, well, Britain as a country, UK as a country has made a commitment to renewable energy, and they'll probably honor that. But as the politics shift and things change, they may decide to go a different way. But that's not necessarily tied to the EU and to the Brexit decision. We have seen a slowdown in government support of pellets in the UK, and currently there's not any funding in the budget for conversions of power plants to pellets. So there has been a slowdown in that regard, and that could continue, but that's not necessarily driven by the Brexit decision. The other market that we look at is the domestic home heating market. That's been pretty slow recently. We had a mild winter, which really cut back demand for wood pellets. Wood pellets generally were oversupplied this heating season, and a lot of pellets remained on the shelves, so that market really slowed down. That market's really driven by economics and substitutes, not really as much by policy. So we'll see what the next heating season brings for the domestic pellet market. Let's talk about Georgia for a few minutes. So Georgia is top ranked in terms of softwood demand across the U.S. South. There are a lot of mills in Georgia, and they're actually powerhouses compared to other states in the South. Sawmills in Georgia use more wood than any other state. So we're top ranked in terms of wood demand at capacity for sawmills in Georgia. Also pulp and paper mills. Pulp and paper mills in Georgia use more wood and have the capacity to use more wood in aggregate than all of the pulp mills in other states when we look at it on a state-by-state basis. For plywood mills, we're actually ranked 5th in the South. We lose out to Louisiana and Arkansas for plywood capacity. Although we do have a lot of plywood capacity, we're ranked 5th there. Really, the Gulf states have more plywood mills than we have in Georgia. For OSB, we're also top ranked for OSB. So our OSB mills are using a lot of wood compared to OSB mills in other states, but we're really barely beating Texas. So Texas also is a leader in OSB capacity in the South, and we barely beat Texas. announced bioenergy. We're also a leader. The bioenergy number would be a projection looking out 10 years. And that number is 10.6 million tons of wood. To put that in perspective for you, our current bioenergy capacity number on an annual basis is 2 million tons. So it's 2 million tons jumping up to 10 million if all of these projects that are announced actually come to pass. And then in terms of log exports, actually, Georgia is a leader relative to other states in the South, but that volume is very small. Really only about 200,000 tons of logs are exported from Georgia every year, or were exported last year from Georgia. So it's a very small number in relation to the other industries in Georgia, but compared to other states in the South, we're a leader, and South Carolina comes in second in terms of log exports. We look at timber supplies, so switching gears a little bit. Where is the wood coming from that is servicing the mills that we've been talking about? Georgia is also top ranked. So this chart represents pine saw timber, well, really pine grade, which includes chip and saw and saw timber inventories. So these are standing inventories. And it shows a snapshot of standing inventories of pine grade in 2015, and then a projection looking out 10 years. So compared to other states in the South, Georgia actually has the largest pine saw timber inventory. Other states that are leaders here are Alabama and Mississippi, but currently Georgia comes in first. We work with Dr. Bob Apt at NC State and are actually part of the SOFAC consortium to model timber supplies over time. So we work with Dr. Apt and we run his model, which is the CERTS model. So several of you may be familiar with that model. But we work with Bob to run that model to project forest supplies looking forward, considering trends in wood demand and considering trends in land ownership, and also looking at the acres profile of the forest and how that forest might perform over time. And looking at that, in terms of Georgia, in terms of growth of pine grade inventory, we project that Georgia will increase pine grade inventory by about 10%, add about 36 million tons to the inventory. The state that we project will have the most increases in pine grade inventory is actually Mississippi. And by these projections, we estimate Mississippi could increase pine grade inventory by 50% moving forward in the next 10 years. So large increases in Mississippi. So what does this really mean for landowners, and what does this mean for wood markets moving forward? Well, we are oversupplied in terms of wood, specifically pine saw timber, across the South. And there are several reasons that we're oversupplied for pine saw timber. One is that we had a recession, and the recession changed the ways that landowners manage their forests. Landowners deferred clear cutting, deferred harvest because timber prices dropped, and landowners waited for prices to recover before they would clear cut their timber and replant it and start the cycle again. So while landowners were deferring harvest during the recession, timber continued to grow on the stump. Pine saw timber got larger, inventories grew. When we came out of the recession, we did see some increase in planting activity, but we already had wood that continued to grow on the stump, so our inventory got even larger. The other thing that happened is that we have had a series of different regulations and policies that have incented planting. And these different policies have changed the profile of the forest in a way that it actually added to that issue. Because at the end of the day, the forest that we have today is really a representation of planting activities and policies of several years ago. So the chart that I'm showing right now is planting activity in the U.S. South. And there's different peaks on the chart. The first peak was in the 1950s. This was in response to the soil bank program. So that was in